Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my video review of the Viltrox Autofocus 28mm F1.8 STM lens. This lens in many ways is kind of the forgotten lens in Viltrox's 2023 lineup. It's actually part of the series that goes back to 2021 that features a 24mm, 35mm, and 50mm F1.8 lenses, along with this 28mm F1.8. It was actually part of their roadmap scheduled to be released back in 2022. But for whatever reason, it got pushed back a little bit. So it's part of that particular series, which is designed around Sony E-mount, which I'm reviewing here. Also available in Nikon Z or Z mount. Viltrox in many ways is just moving so fast. They are a company on the move. And as a byproduct of them moving so fast, the slight delay on this particular lens means that they've already kind of moved past this onto their newest designs, their more 2023 lineup, which are kind of higher quality, even more feature-rich lenses. And so as a byproduct, this lens is not getting a lot of attention because they have so many other high-profile lenses that have come out in 2023. At the same time, however, there aren't a lot of 28mm lenses on Sony. Sony has a lot of lenses at this point. There are so many different E-mount lenses, but 28mm is not a very common one. And what options are there tend to be at extremes, either the very old Sony 28mm f2, which isn't all that amazing optically. Then you have the very large Sigma 28mm f1.4 art, though that's not a DN lens. It wasn't designed for mirrorless, and so it's larger still. It's several times larger than this lens, and of course it's much, much heavier, all of those things. And then, you have some manual focus lenses, the Laowa Argos 28mm f1.2 that I reviewed before, but those tend to be more niche products. So in many ways, I think this lens could serve as the sweet spot for a lot of people who love the 28mm focal length. So the question is it worth its price point of $379 US, or right under $350 if you use the discount code that is in the description down below? Well, that's what we're going to try to answer right after a word from our sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by Fantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Fantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out. So this follows very, very closely in the blueprint for all of the other lenses in this series to date. All of them have nearly identical dimensions. So 70 millimeters in diameter, or 2.8 inches, 88.2 millimeters in length, or 3.5 inches, and it weighs in at 367 grams, or 12.9 ounces. So again, almost all of those physical dimensions are identical, and it's about 17 grams heavier than the 35 millimeter f1.8, which was the last one in this series that I reviewed. Like all of those lenses, the build quality is actually really nice. It's all metal construction. It's built around a brass lens mount. It's very good materials here in the overall design, and the lens feels substantial. It feels quality. There is an aperture ring on this. It is a declicked aperture. It is a little bit on the firm side in terms of the rotation. For stills, that's not really a big deal, but of course, if you wanted to do aperture racking, being on a little on the stiff side could, just cause you to introduce more vibrations. And so not optimal for that. But there are the markings at the 1/3 stop detents on here, or 1/3 stop markings, but not any detents there. Your only detent is between the f16, and then there's some resistance before you get into the automatic mode. So if you don't like an aperture ring, just put it in automatic mode and leave it there, and you can control aperture from within the camera. We have a 9-bladed aperture iris here. And I will note that on Viltrox's newest lenses, they've moved to a little bit higher aperture blade count, but this is the same aperture iris design that we've had for every other lens in this series. It does come with a lens hood. In this case, like all of them, they are plastic, not metal. It is a fairly shallow lens hood. kind of ordinary there, but one thing I will note is that when you reverse it for storage, it reverses really, really tightly. And so it's not going to take up hardly any additional room in the bag. And so that does make it a nice lens hood to bring along, quite easy to deal with. Now, there aren't any of the features that we've now started to come to expect from Viltrox in 2023. There's no focus hold button or AF/MF switch here. There is no weather sealing, unfortunately. But we do have is a Viltrox standard, in that there is a USB-C port on the lens mount that allows you to do easy firmware updates. Unfortunately, another holdover from Viltrox's kind of former lens design is that we have a not overly close minimum focus distance of 37 centimeters and a fairly low maximum magnification of 0.10 times. Now, up close image quality is quite good, but unfortunately, you're not going to get extremely high magnification from this particular lens. One final thing that I'll detail that could be copy specific, but just in case you encounter the same thing, I noticed on both my A7R5 and then my Alpha 1 bodies that I felt like the in-body image stabilization was a little bit jittery with this particular lens. So I wondered if it was properly communicating the focal length. I went into the settings and I changed to a manual setting of 28 millimeters, and immediately that behavior improved. So this is probably something that can be fixed via firmware update, but for whatever reason, at least in this particular copy, I don't think it was sending the right information to the camera in terms of that focal length. And so unfortunately, as a byproduct, the IBIS behavior wasn't quite right. Again, thankfully, we're set up to get easy firmware updates, and that's probably something that needs to be fixed via firmware. So let's talk autofocus. Like all of this series, autofocus comes via a lead screw type STM motor. And so the lead screw type is the more robust, kind of higher end STM motor. And I will note here that focus activity is essentially silent in normal operations. You can hear a very light whirring sound if you put your ear right next to the barrel and do focus, but it's not enough, that, at least in my experience, to be picked up on camera through the onboard mic. So not really an issue there at all. As you can see here, focus speed is fairly good. I tested both indoors and outdoors, and focus transitions are, quick enough and confident. I found that in just general purpose shooting, I had very, very good accuracy, very well focused results. So I don't have any reservations there. I did test some action sequences. And so in this first burst, there are 25 shots. As I went through and evaluated them, I found that there were 21 that were perfectly focused, 3 that I would only call acceptably focused, and then 1 that was a back focus miss. The second sequence here, I shot 31 frames in that sequence, and they're basically all perfect. So got a little bit better result on that one. So for that kind of somewhat predictable action, I got good results. I got not as good a results when Nala was walking persistently towards me. That's something that really only the best cameras do well for whatever reason. And you can see that this was not the best result, in that the closer she got, the more back focused the results got. I also found that IAF did work well under normal conditions when shooting either an animal or human subject. I also found that in low light conditions, I was able to get fine autofocus without any kind of major slowdown. So all of that, I would say, is good. Now, when it came to the video side of things, some good and some bad. When it came to the focus pulls, the pulls themselves are smooth, as you can see. But one thing I noticed, that it never quite nailed the focus on my foreground subject. The background was fine, but the foreground subject was not. It seemed to be somewhat isolated. I didn't have that same kind of issue elsewhere. For example, when it came to my hand test, I didn't have a problem with it transitioning from my hand to my eye. There's one situation where I inadvertently left my eye exposed and it stayed locked on that, which is what it should do. The camera lens combination should do under that circumstance. Overall, however, I would say that that test went well. Likewise, when I was out kind of just shooting various video clips where I wanted to transition from one subject to another, there is a fairly low amount of focus breathing, and so I found that focus transitions looked good. They looked smooth. There wasn't anything jarring about them. And so overall, I would say that autofocus was positive for me. It's not Sony GM level of positive, but for this kind of level or class of lens, this is really quite a strong autofocus performance. So as we look at the image quality from this series, there's a lot of familiar patterns that I saw reemerge here. The MTF chart looks good, but not great. I actually felt like the real world results looked a little bit better than what this MTF chart would suggest to me. But you don't have to take my word for it. Let's dive in and let's take a look together. So we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion here. And so you can see that there's a little bit of a pincushion distortion, and then there is a heavy amount of vignette. Now, while the amount of distortion is minimal, you see I used a -3 to correct, and that works okay in these middle lines, but you can also see that it has kind of artificially created a little bit of unevenness along the edges. And so, unfortunately, it's a little bit of a complex distortion pattern. Now, when it comes to the vignette, I had to max out the sliders here to correct for that. That vignette is very heavy, probably approaching 4 stops in the corners. Now, there is an automatic correction profile, as you can see here. It does fairly good, not perfect, but fairly good with the distortion. You can see, to me, it looks like there's still some vignette that's left over, so it's not corrected quite as much as what I would like. The other major optical flaw here is that there is definitely some fairly pronounced fringing after the plane of focus, and so that's going to show up in some bokeh highlights. You can see just not a ton of the purple so much, but after the plane of focus, definitely some of that green fringing, which will be an issue in some situations. Take this shot right here, and so you can see that if I zoom in here, detail looks pretty good, but you can definitely see after the plane of focus there's some of that green fringing in these high contrast areas. Now, the other type of chromatic aberrations, which are lateral chromatic aberrations, they show up near the edges of frames. You can see here that that's a non-issue. Even without any kind of correction, we have a nice transition from black to white. It's that longitudinal style chromatic aberration that is the problem here. So for our sharpness and resolution test, here is the test chart. I'm going to shoot on a Sony a7R Mark V and show you results here at 200%. So definitely a torture test. That's 61 megapixels shown at very high magnification. And yet, you can see in the middle of the frame, it actually looks quite good. Good detail there. If I pan over this direction, still holding up pretty well. Up in here, contrast has dropped a little bit, as you can see, but still a fairly strong result. And then if we go all the way down towards the corner, you can see that the corners look okay. You could just see that they're just not quite as crisp here as what we have seen there in the center of the frame. Over on this side, the same is true. You know, it's just the details don't really sparkle yet. Now, of course, out in the real world, things aren't quite as demanding. And so here in the sweet spot in the center of the frame, this shot of Ferrari shows a beautiful amount of resolution and texture all throughout his fur. Very, very good focus, as you can see. And so, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that image. Now, stopping down from f1.8 to f2 gives us just a tiny bit of contrast boost there in the center of the frame, going off towards the mid frame. Again, it's a very mild improvement. Down here in the corner, you can see just ever so slightly more contrast, but nothing has really changed all that much yet. Now, it's in the jump from f2 to f2.8 that we have a more significant boost here in the corners. Corners starting to look really quite good. If we pop back to the mid frame, you can see that the mid frame contrast is looking strong. If I go over to this side, you can now see a lot more detail and contrast, a little more sparkle coming into the queen's eyes there. And then if I stop on down to f4, you can see now that there's really, really good contrast and detail. And so everything is strong everywhere we look in the frame. Just a really, really great performance. Right up here into the corner, you can see good detail there. Up here at the top, everything is looking nice and crisp. Now you can see from f5.6 to f8 on this high resolution body that we peak pretty much at f5.6. f8 is almost as good, just a very, very slight bit off. Mid-frame, both look good, but f5.6 is probably a little bit better. And even down here into the corner is the only place where you might just get a slight more at f8, though I think you're splitting hairs at this point. Now, after f8, diffraction is really going to start to hit, and so you can see by f16, which is our minimum aperture, everything has softened up quite a bit, though f16 is not a tiny minimum aperture, and so you can see that it's not great compared to what the lens has been, but neither is it unusable either. Now, as is often the case with these Viltrox lenses, the minimum focus distance and magnification is not great. However, because we're not super close, we've got a nice flat plane of focus and good detail up close. And so as a byproduct, for example, in this shot, again, that's not a lot of magnification, obviously, but if I zoom in there and look at it at 100% magnification, the detail looks really quite good up close. And that leads us to a discussion about the bokeh. Here you can see there's just a little bit of that fringing that shows up here. So a little bit of outlining, but the bokeh looks pretty decent there. In this shot here, a monochrome, I think that everything actually looks really quite nice. Up close, obviously, you have that advantage. Here we can see a fairly good subject isolation and very good detail on the subject. And then as we transition towards defocus, bokeh is looking pretty decent there. This image, I think, looks really, really great, this spider web, and so we've got a nice amount of focus there in the center of the web, and then everything else is pretty nicely defocused. This is another image, and I've kind of given this a processing look, but it really kind of suits the autumn scene. It looks really nice. Now, if you get a situation like this where there isn't a lot of distance between the subject and the background is somewhat busy, as we've got here, you can definitely see that it's not perfectly creamy. So there are situations where the bokeh can tend towards a little bit more busyness if you're not in an optimal situation. Now, I do feel that Viltrox's most recent optical glass is better than what it was in this particular series. You see that a lot with the fringing, for example, and so it's a little more prominent here. At the same time, however, they were making progress throughout the series, and so I feel like the color rendition is better in this lens than what it was in a lot of them. And so colors there actually look really quite rich. Here, I think colors look really, really nice in this image. In this image, obviously, I think colors look really fantastic as well. Now here, once again, I've kind of processed for the misty kind of autumn scene, but you can see that just the images look really, really great. And so the colors here, I have intentionally muted them just a little bit. But overall, I found that images were certainly, I was able to process them and get an end result that I was really quite happy with. Now, flare resistance was another area that I thought actually was quite good for a not overly expensive lens. We can see that contrast is holding up quite well here at the wide open result. In the same setting, you can see the 18-bladed sun star, a little bit of a ghosting pattern here, but to me it looks artistic rather than nasty. And what I found in just general shots where I put the sun in the frame is that they weren't marred by any kind of ghosting artifact. I could stop down and get a little bit of a sunburst, not as clearly defined as what I would like, but looks pretty decent. And all I've gotten here is just a little bit that is not destructive to the image at all. In this setting here, wide open, I think it looks great. And obviously the sun's a little less intense early in the morning like that, but I think the capture of the morning light is nice in that image. In this image here, obviously, we've got the sun right at the frame. This is a middle aperture of f5.6. But you can see there's just a little bit of a ghosting artifact here, but that's it. Otherwise, the image looks really, really great. Another image here where I've intentionally kind of put the sun near here to give the sunburst effect. But you can see contrast and the image looks nice. Overall, looks really good. One final thing that we'll look at, and that is chroma performance for at night. So overall, the look is pretty good here. There's two flaws I want to point out. Number one, because there is a bit of fringing, you can see that on these really bright points of light. The celestial bodies that are brighter, I see a little bit of fringing. And then as we get towards the corner, you can see that it starts to look more like flying insects. So definitely some chroma smear, unfortunately, in the corners of the frame. I did try testing or stopping down to f2. It's not really a significant improvement. It just seems like they're a little bit more in focus. And so this is obviously an image or a lens that you could use for shooting the night sky, but neither is it going to be a top choice for the issues that I have detailed here. So in conclusion, by the standard of this particular series, 24, 35, 50, and then this 28mm lens, I think that this is actually one of the best options in the series. It does a lot of things quite well, and overall image quality results look quite good. I got a lot of great looking images out of it without a whole lot of effort. And so I think that if you're looking for a 28mm lens, I think that it's certainly a worthwhile option. In some ways, the perception of this lens is tainted a little bit, or the fact why it's getting overshadowed somewhat, is it's gotten overshadowed by some better lens releases from Viltrox in 2023. Essentially, what we're getting is a 2022 lens in 2023, and I think that the perception would have been higher of the lens if it were released at its original kind of planned point in 2022. At the same time, it is still perhaps the best, most well-rounded 28mm option on Sony's platform, and I suspect probably on Nikon as well. It's a lens that really doesn't have any kind of major glaring flaws. It does a lot of things quite well, and it certainly serves that focal length very well without a huge investment. So I think it's certainly worth exploring if you love the 28mm focal length and you've been looking for a better option for your Sony or Nikon camera. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. There's some buying links there, linkage to an image gallery. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.